I think this research is really important today. When we look at Latin America and the continent of North America, there's certainly a lot of challenges, but also a lot of grounds for optimism. And I think the lens that Richard applies in the book of looking at capitalism as an economic system, the impacts that it's having on communities and people, and working people in particular, is a lens we have to continue to bring to bear in understanding our own community and also the wider world. But also that connection between the economic system and social movements is really important to keep in mind. And looking at labor as a social movement, not necessarily as institutions or as established organizations, but as a movement of people struggling for a better world. Because I continue to believe that the labor movement is one of the most important, if not the most important, social movements in finding our way out of a world dominated by capitalist interests and transitioning to a world more based on cooperation and moving away from the exploitation of people and ecological systems. So.
Crucible, what is a crucible? And we think of a crucible as a sort of an ancient kind of device for melting different metals, producing a new alloy, something new. One of the definitions, if you Google it or whatever, is that a crucible is a place or situation in which different elements interact to produce something new. And I think the book is very exciting in the possibilities it explores for the continent of North America to be a place, to be this kind of place in the early 21st century where different social forces might interact to produce something new. So I think it's very appropriately titled. Another reason I'm excited about this book is that it puts class struggle and the strategic importance of labor solidarity right at the center. And I think that's where it belongs. In my field, sociology, and where I teach, UVic, there's been a relative dearth of attention to the question of labor. And just a few scholars at UVic really look at labor issues, I would say. The movements that grab attention are very important movements: ecological movements, indigenous movements, gender, sexuality movements, disability. All of these are important movements in their own right. But the labor movement is particularly important as well, especially for the issues that, that Dick and his co-author take up here. On my own research, as Ben mentioned, has been very much focused on the structure of corporate power in Canada and globally. But I've also done a lot of research in the sociology of social movements. And again, in that field, labor is often given rather little attention. And yet, labor really is the social force that, in combination with nature, creates all wealth. And it's fundamental to who we are and to our possibilities as human beings as we move forward. So I think, as Dick and Adair point out on page 112 of this book, without the active participation, even leadership of the working people, there will never be an exit from capitalism. So if we're talking about somehow getting out of this morass of class society, we have to be talking about labor, the labor movement, the prospects of labor as a collective actor on the global stage ultimately, but certainly locally, from the local right through to the global. And the third thing that excites me about this book is the very deft way in which the authors weave together a complex analysis of transformation. This is transformation of the North American continent, where we live, where a lot of people live. And it's a transformational process that's occurred over decades, 4 decades into its 5th decade. This is, of course, the neoliberal transformation. It's the big business agenda, right? And the stunning success of that agenda, of that project, in transforming the conditions of life on this continent. But the book is very good in detailing all of that, but it's also very good in detecting some of the openings for change, for defeating that agenda through democratic movements from below, through a kind of continentalism from below, which is, I think, is a very, very apt turn of a phrase. And finally, I'm excited by the way these authors conduct a Marxist analysis that focuses on class struggle and class formation without reducing the world to economic relations, and while highlighting ways that other relations of power, gendered power, racialized power, statist power, how these other forms of power intersect with class power in producing the kind of result that we now live. But that also opens to alternative futures if we can sort of get our acts together in terms of social movement politics, including labor movement politics. In academe, in the past number of years, there's been a kind of revival of Marxism as the global crisis of capitalism deepens. It's not surprising. And yet much of the new scholarship, I think, that is Marxist, in one sense or another, operates at a fairly abstract, schematic level and invokes ideas of the multitude and so on and so forth that you may or may not be familiar with. But I think Dick and Adair in this book demonstrate to us the virtues of a well-researched, very concrete analysis of the socio-historical conditions and relations that shape who we are and our conditions of life. And it's informed by a Gramscian sensibility. It's informed by the question of hegemony, of leadership, of capitalist class leadership, but also of counter-hegemony, of how ordinary people can get together and work together to create a radical alternative to neoliberal capitalism. So I think the book has that nice balance between a critique of class society, a particular kind of class society that we have now in North America, and a kind of attempt to show the possibilities for an alternative, at least the possibilities in the sense of the possibilities for reviving a continent-wide labor movement, which is really, as I say, at the center of this book. On page 98 of the book, this is where Dick and Adair write, an effective fight back against the continental capitalist offensive requires working class responses that include but go beyond the local, regional, and national. The fight back also has to be continental. Strategies that promote greater solidarity between unions, between unionized and non-unionized workers, and across national borders have to be developed. There are both encouraging prospects as well as serious obstacles to the development of such solidarity. So we get a very strong message here that what we need is solidarity, and a particular kind of solidarity, particular kind of labor solidarity that spills over into other forms of human solidarity, and that is transformative. It's not a protectionist solidarity that's trying to just protect, you know, the wages and working conditions of unionized workers in a particular industry, let's say. It needs to be a much more inclusive solidarity that's transformative. They say, the fight needs to be a fight against capitalist power, a power that rests on vast institutional structure of economic, ideological, and political institutions. In this sense, the fight it's not a question of going back to some sort of rosy period of post-war class compromise and reconstructing the welfare state. Really, what these authors are telling us is that we need to move forward. And moving forward is moving beyond capitalism. And that's a very daunting thought for us to try to digest. But that is the message of this book as I read it. And, you know, Dick can correct me on that point if he needs to later on. But with that in mind, how do we move forward? How do we do something beyond just recreating the welfare state? Well, that's not what this book is about. But they do say, on page 140, they point to the need for counter-hegemonic perspectives, okay? Really trying to think through and develop in practice alternatives to the capitalist way of life that otherwise we just sort of swim in as fish in the water. We need to develop alternatives. We need to develop alternatives in the way we think about the world and the way we envisage the future, but also in our day-to-day lives. They say there has been an absence of counter-hegemonic perspectives and organizations that could situate these struggles in a complex of strategy, alternative, and ongoing organizational structures. And on page 132, we find that kind of image in play. They say the crucible of North American transformation is heating up, but its outcome is far from clear. So here the crucible is a key, it's a process here that's heating up. It's getting hotter and hotter. There might be a melding of these nationally specific class movements into something new, into something that's a deeper kind of solidarity. So we have a notion of transformation here, which is basic to a notion of crucible. What happens in a crucible is transformation. Transformation of different social forces combining, different working classes, constructing a transformative solidarity that remakes them as a unified force. So a very hopeful, powerful image, which is what I want to leave you with in terms of my final comment for now on the book. So thanks for inviting me to speak, Dick, and congratulations on an excellent book.
The book Continental Crucible discusses developing alliances between Canada, American, and Mexican workers along class lines, as opposed to the more traditional paternalistic, self-centered, or sometimes ethnically motivated alternatives. And a quote from the book, I can't tell you what page, something that I read tonight. Open quote, "The CLC remains firmly embedded in the notion of working with your own capitalist to become more competitive and keep jobs in your own country," end quotes. Open quotes, "The preservation of jobs through concession and state subsidies may lead to a reprieve of job losses for a period, but in the long run contributes to the downward harmonization of wages," end of quote. In my opinion, this type of class concessions, which does not recognize that the mythical social contract is dead, is more or equally detrimental to the working class than the measures imposed by the capitalist class, as it creates a culture of vulnerability, passivity, and resignation on workers. Why pay union dues or even have a union if I have a lousy deal out of it? It is also a mechanism that helps the dominant ideology to reinforce the myth that unions are outdated. We don't need unions to lead us into concessions. The book also comments on the experience either of broad coalitions led or with a strong influence from trade unions, such as the case in the Teachers Federation in Quebec and in BC. However, open quote, "None of the goals of these movements can be achieved by trade union struggles alone. The formidable challenge for the left is to find ways to foster convergence of these struggles without subordinating the particular needs and demands of each struggle," end of quote. This is what the Vice President of Bolivia, Álvaro García Linera, calls the citizen trade unionist, whereby the trade unionist doesn't only advocate for his own gains, but the betterment of the entire society. The citizen trade unionist identifies himself or herself with the broad community, with the school, with the students, with the homeless, with the unemployed, with the sick, with the old. The citizen trade unionist is a point of reference for the community, and whatever the citizen trade unionist gets, the community also gets. It is through the citizenship union that the worker gets an identity from the government labor agencies, from the employer, from the business community, and the recognition in the community that someone who represents not only his own interests, but also everyone's. The book also goes on to suggest that, open quote, a workers' insurgency in Mexico, if at all successful, would immediately be attacked by both the Canadian and the US regimes. And, open quote, we believe that a workers' insurgency in Mexico could be the spark of a new wave of North American class struggle. But there is a significant potential for a popular explosion in Mexico, along the lines of the ones that have recently occurred in other parts of the world. End of quotes. The only guarantee that there is no guarantee is that there is no guarantee. That this explosion will take place. The path of social struggles are difficult and often meanders back and forth. The extreme poverty and living conditions in Mexico are not guarantee of a rising revolution by themselves. It is true that the potential exists, but it has its limitation. Poverty alone does not generate emancipation. Poverty alone can also generate despair, isolation, which can lead to frustration and inaction, and in some cases, fascism. People do not fight only because they are poor, but they also fight because they believe that fighting cannot stop being poor, but there must exist a hope of winning. It needs to be a fight against capitalist power, power that rests on a vast institutional structure of economics, ideological and political institutions. I add myself that must be ultimately a fight for real and participatory democracy. I want to put a name to that, democracy. A democracy that cannot be, as it is now, reduced to a set of procedures for like a private sport competition among elites. A democracy, as it is now, that cannot be reduced to a set of rules for whoever compete in a process that most people do not understand and have no ability to control when his or her expectations are betrayed. Civil rights are important because they represent important institutional achievements in which working people, the citizen trade unionists, for example, played an important role in acquiring. However, there cannot be a true democracy where there is fear of losing employment, losing one's home, getting sick and unable to obtain timely medical care, or living off a meager pension. Thus, democracy needs the streets, and the streets need democracy. Electoral competitions are important, but for democracy to mean something, it has to offer the ability for the citizen to feel included, active, and involved deciding the fate of their neighborhood, deciding the fate of the city, deciding the fate of their country, deciding layoff, deciding investment, deciding growing economy, deciding the budget allocation for health and education. Democracy, whether in Canada, Mexico, or the US, must be rejuvenated, revitalized, and must cease to be the repetitive fossil monopoly of the ruling elites. Democracy of the streets guarantees a new kind of governance, the possibility of a beautification of our countries, and must reside in the electoral victories that are crucial, but must also lie in an ongoing dialogue and a permanent building of another kind of democracy. Democracy of the street, union democracy, citizens' democracy, where men and women affected by austerity policies and who feel called to serve a common destiny, taken to the street to meet with neighbors, to protest, to march, to express a position, to advocate for support, is the only way to contemporary democracies can come out of the fossilized democracies, creating other levels of sociability and new models of governance.
A few times when I was giving talks at different places, in fact, it was in California once, to a group of left Latin Americanists, Latinos, and then another talk to a group of old, white Marxists, all very sophisticated people. I discovered, among other things, that they had never read Bill's work, that they really didn't know about the capitalist offensive. They knew about the capitalist offensive. They knew about neoliberalism. But they didn't know about how much it was an organized, conscious effort, how the capitalist class organized itself in the 1970s and early 1980s in North America. The big peak organizations of each of these three countries that are so powerful were formed in the early 70s. The Business Roundtable in the United States, the Business Council on National Issues in Canada, modeled on the Business Roundtable, and now called the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. And in Mexico, the Council of Mexican Businessmen, which only exists of 40 people, which dominates larger business organizations. The capitalist class organized itself consciously to transform the society. It organized think tanks. It sponsored think tanks to change common sense. And of course, it dominates and owns the mass media. And their offensive, as Bill summarized well, has been tremendously effective. And the fight back by labor in North America has been tremendously ineffective because mostly labor has fought as if the old rules of the game applied in more sectional ways, groping for new understandings, but not realizing that it's a new ballgame and a new kind of class struggle has to be engaged in from below. We try to outline some of this in the book.
But I did want to say something about elections and the federal election. Obviously, that's something on the horizon. People are very concerned to turf the so-called Harper government out. It's, again, hard to be really optimistic. If the Harper government is turfed out, I think that would be a very important victory of sorts. But what will replace the Harper government? Obviously nothing terribly different, presumably a government somewhat less semi-fascistic, but we're talking about sort of positions along a spectrum of neoliberalism more than something like in terms of an alternative to the kind of politics that we have federally and certainly provincially in this province. So, as I say, in a sense, I reinforce your pessimism, but I do think we need to be, in principle, optimistic in the sense of recognizing that our own efforts, particularly collectively, can make a difference.
You talk about something beyond the practices that we have so far been tackling for social change. And I also heard Carlos say, the problem is that we don't know what the problem is. And to me, it sounds the same as saying, well, we need to do something, but we don't know exactly what that something is. And I have asked this question before to politicians. How about direct democracy and participatory budgets and referendums? And usually the answer is, that's too expensive. We can't afford it. Now, I know that that's not true because the internet is almost free. And a little website with a system, with a computerized system to tabulate different answers is very simple. So it's not really expensive. But I think it's more the fear of losing this relationship between leader and follower. We have the leaders of the party, the political parties, and they don't want to lose the power that they have to make the political decisions for every one of us. So on elections day, what we do is we go and give them, the political leaders, the power to make all those decisions for the next 3 or 4 years. So I was wondering what you think about the idea of demanding from any candidate that we vote for in this election that they legislate only by referendum.
You know, our current political system of representative democracy it's one of the weakest forms of democracy in the world, particularly when you consider the first past the post electoral system, which weakens it further. You know, we don't have a system of proportionate representation. And I agree that basically there's a need, really pressing need for democratic reform in Canada. And I guess participatory budgeting, definitely, whether at the local level or even more broadly. These are methods that have been worked out in places like Brazil and other parts of the world, and they work. There's no reason not to begin implementing them, I think, wherever possible, really, because the more we can shift to a participatory democracy, the less politically alienated people will feel, the more involved they will be in political issues, the more sense of empowerment they'll have. I mean, in a kind of class system of representative democracy, the only people who really feel empowered are capitalists and politicians and, you know, basically the ruling class, if you like. But the more we can make democracy participatory, the more it really becomes democracy, not just a kind of dead letter democracy, which is what we have in Canada today.
So could we change that political system from electing representatives to electing executive ministers that are going to administer our legislation, the people's legislation, by referendum?
Well, Bill has answered the question very well, and I agree with Bill. But what I would like to add or underline is that real democracy, direct democracy, participative democracy is very hard to achieve, is very fragile as long as capitalist power remains intact. And that's especially true, I think, in the area of referendums. I'm very, very uneasy about referendums in capitalist society because with the means of communication, as the consciousness industry, the media, so controlled by so few people, it's very hard to get out counter messages. With spending for propaganda, for campaigns, so much on the side of capitalists, it's hard to defeat them in referendums. I'm not saying we can't, but I'm saying we have to think about direct democracy in capitalism and direct democracy in the transition to get rid of capitalism and direct democracy as a different kind of society.
Hi, do you have an opinion? If you want to register it, go to nowpolling.ca right now, and you can register whatever kind of opinion you would like. And if you don't see it, you can scroll to the bottom of the page and you can put your own question down and poll yourself. Yay! What a good idea.